Yeah, is my screen visible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, let us begin. Okay, so welcome everyone for this episode 007. I would like to thank Sahastra ENT Foundation and Dr. Sri Harsha for allowing me to present the interesting cases. Uh, so So some rituals, I have nothing to disclose, informed consent obtained from all the patients, and I'm sharing my personal experience. And there are some aspects of these cases which I still don't know. So I'll try to present some evidence for some of my findings. And the learning objective, as we know, is like every time I'm presenting complex cases, which have taught me lessons, we can say, because every case is interesting and every case teaches something. So last time also we did this. Just go to menti.com in another browser or in the mobile phone and type this particular code, and so that it will become interactive, so that I'll interact with all of you. So if there are few votes, I will proceed further. I'll just wait for a few seconds. Like go to this particular website www.menti.com and use the code 52748975 so that you can interact with questions, because I'm going to present some questions during while presenting the cases. Okay, so mm, so go to this particular website and type this particular code. So I'll begin and then you can do because the same code will be there. So just before beginning the presentation, I'll tell you summarize few things, and then we'll go into the cases. So we know that there are three types of presentations of vestibular disorders. One is episodic vestibular syndrome, acute vestibular syndrome, and chronic vestibular syndrome. And in episodic, it could be triggered episodic or it could be spontaneous episodic. And there is one more syndrome that is drop attacks. That is also one of the syndrome. So suppose these are the central causes and common central causes. These are the common peripheral causes and the common other causes. Okay. And so BPPV is most common triggered episodic vestibular syndrome. Vestibular migraine, TIAs, Meniere's disease are the common cause of spontaneous episodic syndrome. Acute unilateral vestibulopathy versus stroke is a common cause of acute vestibular syndrome. And triple PD, persistent postural perceptual dizziness, is a most common cause of chronic vestibular syndrome. And as I told, the fifth one is falls and drop attacks, like balance related falls. So if you see in our vestibular practice, these 7-8 disorders are most common and they form 80% of the vestibular practice. So if we are thorough in these disorders, it's very it's very rewarding to treat these patients with vestibular disorders. So history forms integral part of all the evaluation of all these patients, because that helps in us in solving the mystery. And in triggered episodic, if suppose you ask me in limited time how you can manage these patients, is the most important aspect of examination I will put first. For example, in triggered episodic vestibular syndrome, I will do the positional testing first. Then spontaneous episodic syndrome, we have to go for ABCD2 score and or audiometry, because Meniere's is one of the differential diagnoses. In acute vestibular syndrome, hints plus examination takes the priority. And chronic vestibular syndrome, ocular motor examination and cerebellar signs. So according to the syndrome, you can prioritize your examination. So this is the pyramid, like investigations, examination, and history. So history forms integral part of vestibular diagnosis, that is 70 to 80% of times. Alone history will help you to diagnose. Examination and VNG will add another 20 to 25%, and investigations help around 5 to 10%. Other investigations like MRI, audiometry, VHITs. So let us dive into the cases. Coming to case number one. So case number one is nothing but the case. This case I presented last time, and there are a patient had few. I presented this case as recurrent vestibulopathy, and we had a discussion whether it could be central or peripheral last time. So there are some clues which I obtained in last 1 month after that presentation, and that it is a it's very interesting case, and we will go into that. So just for the those who didn't attend the last time, I'll just revise. 55-year gentleman, he is known hypertensive, diabetic, and hyperlipidemia, and this was his timeline: December, January, and February. So in December, he had acute vestibular syndrome with imbalance to right side. He was hospitalized. He underwent MRI brain, which was normal, and he was discharged on vestibular suppressants. On 21st December, he had this. He recovered from it, and again, he had acute vestibular syndrome with imbalance to right side. He was hospitalized again. And MRI brain was not reported as normal, but I'm going to show you what has happened. And he was discharged on antiplatelets and statins, but the diagnosis this time was a stroke, and he was discharged on antiplatelets and statins. So he was on that. And patient first consulted me on 17th of January because they had a lot of questions like what is he suffering from, why is he getting all those episodes. And I presented this case in Vertigo Talks episode 6 on 12 February as recurrent vestibulopathy. And there are some new findings which have happened recently. He told me on 25th of February that I can't feel anything on left side, and he was getting hiccups, and there was increase in the vertigo. So this is another third episode, a worsening of his symptoms at this point of time. It was a teleconsultation. He didn't come to visit me. So I went into his previous MRI and I tried to see what has gone wrong with this patient, why I didn't consider last time I posed some questions. There are some things which I can't explain. So there are some clues to this in this patient which pointed towards the central etiology. One is hiccups he started getting, and he has reduced sensation on left side of the body. So these are the two things which definitely point towards a central etiology. Hiccups is because of the irritation of the nucleus ambiguous. If there is involvement of nucleus ambiguous, it causes hiccups. And reduced sensation of one side of the body is involvement of spinothalamic fibers. So let us go one by one. So last time I told like 2 discrete episode, but now he has 3 episodes and normal MRI, but it was not actually normal. I changed the contrast of the MRI, I changed the brightness, and then I could find out that you can see the lateral medulla. In the lateral medulla, right lateral medulla, you can see one hyperintensity. This is the second MRI which was showing this. not the first MRI. First MRI was absolutely normal, and this is diffusion weighted MRI, which is showing a diffusion restriction in this particular area, like right lateral medulla. And there is one more interesting finding, which I will keep it for case number second. That's very interesting. Like this vertebral artery is compressing over the and ventrolateral aspect of medulla. That we will keep it. Like we will discuss about this later. So this is what these were the findings. This was the last time we conducted a poll, and these were the results. And now fresh poll will take if you have to go to this menti.com and you have to type this code. If I will start the timer for 15 seconds, if you guys can vote, not 1 second, I'll 30 seconds, I'll just wait. I think last time you all of you, most of you joined it, but maybe I think there is some issue with this, so I will move forward. Okay, so it was MRI negative. Like in December, the first episode was negative for stroke, and the second was is positive retrospectively, and that's the reason why patient was started on antiplatelets and statins. And then one by one we will go into the clues what the patient had. Even we discussed about this particular clue, that the patient had this head tilt towards the left side. So he's having head tilt towards the left side. And just look at his hands, what he's showing. He's showing his oscillopsia. How is his oscillopsia? He feels that the objects were moving to one side torsionally. It is not side to side. It was in the circular fashion. So he was having the clue number 3 is head tilt, and clue number 4 is torsional oscillopsia. His oscillopsia is persistent. We don't get this particular examination or historical finding in patients with vestibular neuronitis. And he was showing me that whenever he patches his eye, he feels better. One eye, whenever he patches, he feels okay, like his vision is better. So it is a binocular phenomenon. That's why he's feeling monocular. He's able to manage, but binocular vision he's not able to manage properly. And last time we had a discussion that the patient had left beating nystagmus, but there are more findings like this is vertical saccades, and patient had upbeating nystagmus on both the gazes. Vertical saccade was normal, but now coming to the smooth pursuit. Smooth pursuit, if you see, it was saccadic. If you can see here, it is saccadic like this. As compared to the right side, this side, it is when the eyes are moving from left to right, it is less. There are less saccadic abnormality as compared to moving from the right to the left. Okay, so this patient had this saccadic smooth pursuit, and so impaired pursuit from right to left than left to right. Okay, and even in vertical smooth pursuit, you can see that the patient had saccadic vertical smooth pursuit, and which is also more prominent on while going from down to up as compared to up to down. Okay, then coming to the nystagmus findings, the nystagmus finding, the horizontal nystagmus and the vertical nystagmus. Now you can see that the patient didn't have spontaneous nystagmus in light. There was no horizontal nystagmus, but patient had a pure torsional nystagmus that was seen in the video. I will show you the video in the next slide. But meanwhile, in the dark, the patient had left beating nystagmus in dark, and in light the patient had a little upbeating component, mild upbeating component, which was enhanced in the dark. So the clue number 7 is in light, like that is with fixation, the patient had predominantly torsional nystagmus with slight upbeating component. But usually in peripheral causes, we see horizontal torsional nystagmus and not pure torsional nystagmus. That is very important clue. And in dark, the patient had torsional nystagmus with enhanced upbeating and the horizontal left beating component. So in dark, the patient had a mixed variety of nystagmus. So just to give you some inputs regarding peripheral vestibular disorders, what happens in superior vestibular neuritis, patients will have predominantly horizontal nystagmus with torsional and upbeating component. In inferior vestibular neuritis, the patient will have downbeating torsional nystagmus. In vestibular nerve proper or labyrinthine involvement, the patient will have horizontal or horizontal torsional nystagmus. Okay. So in this patient, it was not fitting into any of these patterns. It is not fitting into the pure torsional component was predominant, and without fixation, the patient had all three components. So let us see the video. So I hope you are able to appreciate the this nystagmus. Like you can see, there is a pure torsional variety of nystagmus with little upbeating component. So there is a torsional levocyclorotatory nystagmus. If you can see, look at this particular light, you can see appreciate the torsional component. So with fixation, the patient had pure torsional, predominantly torsional, and mild upbeating component was also there. And center gaze without fixation, the patient had all three components like mixed torsional, upbeating, and left beating. So there were left beats, upbeats, and there was torsional component also. So one most important thing to remember here is in central lesions also you can get suppression of the components of nystagmus with fixation. Like patients may not might have mixed variety of nystagmus without fixation, and which can get suppressed with fixation, and the torsional component gets doesn't get suppressed as compared to the other components, the vertical and the horizontal component. And one more important thing to notice here is the pupillary asymmetry. Can you see that? You look at the pupils, the right side pupil as compared to the left side pupil. There is asymmetry of the pupil. Look at this and this. So you can see here also there is asymmetry of the pupil. And if you can appreciate one more finding, is look at this distance of the palpebral fissure of this side and the other side. If you notice that the palpebral fissure is less reduced in length in the on the right side as compared to the left side. So both these features are going in favor of Horner syndrome. Okay, so this is another clue. There is a pupillary asymmetry, that is the this sided pupil, there is meiosis on the right side, and there is like ptosis, little ptosis in the on the right side. This palpebral fissure is less wide as compared to the this sided palpebral fissure. Okay. So coming to spontaneous, coming to the findings, spontaneous torsional more than upbeating nystagmus on center case. On removing the fixation, no, not on removing the fixation. Yes, on removing the fixation, left and upbeating components were prominent. And there is one reason for this, which is mentioned in Paul Brazis, one of a neurological book. The central mechanism suppress the vertical and horizontal components as compared to the torsional components. So many a times you can see horizontal component, many a times you can see the torsional component of nystagmus. Even in BPPV with fixation, if you do the positional testing, the torsional component can appear predominant. But if you do without fixation, you can see the vertical and horizontal components. So it is very important during positional testing to do it by removing the fixation, that either Frenzel's or either with the help of VNG, it is very important to remove the fixation. Now coming to the very important findings, that is what is happening in case of the high frequency head shake. In case of high frequency head shaking, this patient had biphasic variety of nystagmus. So the patient had initial right beats followed by the left beating nystagmus. And during high frequency head shaking, the upbeating component disappeared, which was there, but it disappeared. So we will discuss that. So let us see during head shaking what happened. You can see there are right beats initially. And there was a pause, and this pause was followed by left beating nystagmus. And now we are going to discuss about biphasic nystagmus, how to interpret it, and what happens in peripheral vestibular lesion. In vestibular neuritis, what's the pattern of biphasic nystagmus? We'll just see that. So the patient had head shaking induced nystagmus. It was initially right beating followed by the left beating. So in peripheral vestibular disease, what happens is patients initially in the acute phase, they have monophasic contralesional beating head shaking nystagmus. 1 month after the visit, that is in subacute phase, many patients, like around 72% in this study, the patient had biphasic nystagmus, and it beats contralegionally first and then ipsilegional beating. So let us see what happens in peripheral vestibulopathy. Suppose the patient has right vestibulopathy. In the acute stage, patients will have left beating nystagmus because this vestibule is not working. Okay, so this vestibule is not working. So the push-pull mechanism, you must be aware, the resting tone is gone on this side. So the slow phase of nystagmus is towards the right side and the fast phase is towards the left side. So the nystagmus beats towards the left side in case of right vestibulopathy. And but in subacute phase, in patients with vestibular neuritis, what you will get is you will get biphasic nystagmus in almost 72% patients. That is initial, the nystagmus beats will be similar to those of acute stage, and then it will beat ipsilegionally. Okay. And this presence of biphasic nystagmus correlated very well with the degree of canal paresis. So the more severe the canal paresis, those patients are likely to get the biphasic variety of nystagmus. This is about the peripheral vestibulopathy. But in this particular patient, I got this biphasic nystagmus in a presumed central etiology. So biphasic nystagmus doesn't exclude the central etiology, and it is very important to check other signs and symptoms. Okay. Now coming to the hyperventilation induced nystagmus, the patient had enhanced enhancement of the component, left beating component on hyperventilation, enhanced left beating on nystagmus, and that there was also enhancement of this upbeating nystagmus. For example, if you see here, the upbeating nystagmus got enhanced from this particular slow phase velocity to this particular slow phase velocity. It got enhanced. Even the horizontal left beating nystagmus also got enhanced. So on the basis of slow phase velocity, there are three varieties of hyperventilation induced nystagmus. I will show you what are the types in this particular study. Professor Luigi Califano, they have largest series of patients with hyperventilation induced nystagmus, and in this particular series, they have categorized the hyperventilation induced nystagmus into four types. Whenever there is no spontaneous nystagmus and the patient develops hyperventilation induced nystagmus, that is HVIN, then a paretic pattern, they have classified it as if the patient has a spontaneous nystagmus and that spontaneous nystagmus increases in the degrees, then it is a paretic type of or inhibitory type of hyperventilation induced nystagmus. Excitatory pattern is nothing but the patient has baseline spontaneous nystagmus which reduces in intensity. It reduces in intensity or disappears on hyperventilation. And the strongly excitatory pattern is nothing but reversal of the nystagmus. Inversion of the spontaneous nystagmus is called as strongly excitatory pattern. Okay, so in case of acute vestibular neuritis, what happens is in this particular study, what they have showed is 27% patients get hyperventilation induced nystagmus. The most common pattern is paretic pattern. Paretic pattern of hyperventilation induced nystagmus is the most common because there is a paresis of that particular side, and that's why the patients get paretic type. There is enhancement of the the horizontal component after the hyperventilation. Okay. Now they try to differentiate vascular and inflammatory etiology. Like in case of acute vestibular syndrome, what happens is the major differential diagnosis is between inflammatory, that is vestibular neuritis, versus stroke, which is a vascular etiology. So let us see first the hyperventilation induced nystagmus in this particular patient, and then we will move on. Can you see that there are predominantly this patient has left beating nystagmus. There are few increased upbeating component, and there is torsional component which is beating towards the levocyclorotatory torsional component. So after hyperventilation, there was enhancement of the baseline nystagmus. So that's why it is a paretic type of nystagmus. And then I will show you the paper, the proposal by Professor Luigi Califano, where they tried to differentiate vascular and inflammatory etiology based on the types of hyperventilation induced nystagmus, and there are some other things. For example, they calculated three parameters. One is global cardiovascular health risk factor, which is composite of vascular risk factors. In this particular patient, the total score was 10, and this patient had 27%. That is very high risk of getting a cardiovascular or cerebrovascular event. According to the paper that is going to get published, Professor Califano, to differentiate between vascular and inflammatory etiology, if the patient has less global cardiovascular risk, excitatory type of hyperventilation induced nystagmus, and the spontaneous nystagmus duration is more than 72 hours, most likely this patient has inflammatory etiology, that is vestibular neuritis. And if the patient has high global cardiovascular risk and inhibitory or paretic type of HVIN, and the spontaneous nystagmus duration is less than 72 hours, then it is more likely to be a vascular etiology. So in this particular patient had high global cardiovascular risk, and the patient had paretic type of hyperventilation induced nystagmus. although the spontaneous nystagmus duration was not less than 72 hours. So in his particular lecture, he told that it is a no man's land, it is a gray area where it could be either inflammatory or it could be vascular. Okay. So coming back to the findings of gaze testing in this particular patient, let us check whether the patient's gaze testing findings were following the Alexander's law. So there was no nystagmus in the center gaze with fixation, but without fixation, the patient had left beating nystagmus. Again, there was left beating on left gaze, left beating in up gaze, left beating in down gaze. So let us, in this particular patient, this patient had unidirectional left beating nystagmus without fixation. And the most important question to be asked to differentiate between vascular and inflammatory etiology or acute vestibular neuritis versus stroke is the nystagmus pattern following the Alexander's law. Let us look at this particular thing. Yeah. So look at the nystagmus in the left gaze, 4.7 slow phase velocity, 4.7 to 5. In the center gaze, it should get reduced. There should be reduction in the intensity of the nystagmus, slow phase velocity in the center gaze as compared. This should be maximum, this should be little less, and this should be either absent or it should be further less. That is okay, this is accepted. But here in the center gaze, the patient had higher slow phase velocity as compared to the left gaze. So this particular thing is not following the Alexander's law. So that's why it is not following Alexander's law, which is followed in the peripheral vestibulopathy. That is another clue. So this is clue number 10 in this particular patient for considering a central diagnosis as compared to the peripheral. So why I'm going in so much details is so that in a given patient, it is very important to differentiate between whether the patient has central or peripheral etiology. So it's very important that we discuss all this so that you might find some clues are there, and then you will be able to differentiate. So next is the upbeating nystagmus, which was seen in this particular patient. That we will not go into details because like Alexander's law is not followed in the this particular patient, and upbeating component again was more predominant as compared to the horizontal component. That is against the vestibulopathy, in which horizontal component is predominant. Now the next clue is the head impulse test. Surprisingly, in this patient, the head impulse test was positive on the left side. So on right side, he is looking, yeah, you just see here, right side, it is bang on the target, but on the left side, the patient had positive head impulse. So I hope you could appreciate that. And the head impulse was pathological on left side. So it was positive contralateral to the stroke side of the stroke. Like we are expecting right lateral medullary infarct, but the head impulse is pathological on the left side. So why this is happening, we will see. This is one paper by Professor Ji Soo Kim, and in his paper, they also found that contralesional head impulse test was positive in patients who had NPH lesions, like NPH, the stroke in the involving the nucleus prepositus hypoglossai. And in these patients also, the patients had spontaneous nystagmus, which had all the three components, like mixed variety of nystagmus. And head shaking induced nystagmus, the patients had unidirectional. But in my particular patient, the patient had biphasic variety of head shaking nystagmus. And if we see the ocular tilt reaction, which involves the head tilt also, some patients had ipsilegional tilt, and some patients did have contralegional tilt. That again in this particular patient, it can explain the contralesional tilt. Okay, and then coming to the SVV tilt, that is also we are going to see in this particular patient. It could be either normal or ipsilesional or contralesional. So that is also we are going to see. Now let us see why the head impulse test was positive contralesionally in this particular patient. So I would like to emphasize 2 points. Head impulse test can be positive even in central lesions at some specific locations like vestibular nucleus or lesion, or it is involving the NPH, or it is involving the nerve fibers, which are fascicular fibers of the vestibular nerve, which are traveling through the pontomedullary junction. And even in floccular lesions, there are cases where they have mentioned the head impulse test positive in this particular group of patients. So head impulse positive alone doesn't say that it is central versus peripheral. It doesn't mean that it is a peripheral etiology. You have to go into the details of other signs also. So why this head impulse test came positive in contralesionally in this particular patient? Let us go into the details of that. So these are the two nucleus prepositus hypoglossi. So NPH inhibits the other sided NPH nucleus contralateral, and then even the nucleus prepositus hypoglossi inhibits the inferior olivary nucleus. And next is inferior olivary nucleus inhibits the flocculus on the contralateral side, and the flocculus inhibits the ipsilateral vestibular nucleus. So, for example, if a patient has lesion in the right vestibular nucleus, for example, lesion in the right NPH, a nucleus prepositus hypoglossi, what will happen is the inhibition on the inferior olivary nucleus on the contralateral side is gone. So there is increased excitation of the inferior olivary nucleus, and then this inferior olivary nucleus is supposed to inhibit this flocculus, but because it is upregulated, it is further inhibited, and then further inhibition leads to increased activity of the ipsilateral vestibular nucleus. Okay, and contralaterally there is reduced activity of vestibular nucleus, and that's why opposite sided pathological head impulse, like the head impulse is pathological on the contralateral side in patients with right or NPH infarction. Whenever there is involvement of nucleus prepositus hypoglossi in this particular patient, they they have demonstrated that it can be positive. Coming to the hints plus examination in this patient, the head impulse test, we have seen it was pathological. That doesn't mean it goes in favor of peripheral, but in this particular patient, it was a central lesion. This patient had pure torsional variety of spontaneous nystagmus. That is typically a central sign. Test of skew in this patient, I don't have video, but it was normal, and there was no acute hearing loss. So if any one of these finding is in favor of central, that means it is a central. Now coming to the SVV, in this particular patient, I did the subjective visual vertical testing. Just a minute, just a minute. Yeah, I'm really sorry. So if in this particular patient, when I did the subjective visual vertical, there was significant tilt to the right side. And again, one more important question is why this particular patient is having tilt towards the other side, like we are suspecting a stroke on right side, and this particular patient had subjective visual tilt on the left side. So this is one of the paper which showed that controversive tilt can happen in lateral medullary infarction. Okay. So now coming to the Unterberger's test in this particular patient, it was so usually in acute peripheral vestibulopathy, you will see pivoting towards one side, but can you see that this particular patient was not pivoting to one side. It was atypical, and you can see the wide base stance of the patient. You can see the stance of the patient. It is a wide base stance, and he was not pivoting to one particular side. So that is another thing which is going in favor of the patient who had severe ataxia, wide based, and there was no particular lateralization towards one side. Okay, and this is one of the paper which showed that Unterberger's test is not useful for central lesions. They have it is very useful test for acute peripheral vestibulopathy, but not the central causes. Now coming to different ocular motor abnormalities in Wallenberg syndrome, that is lateral medullary syndrome, which we are suspecting. In this particular patient, this patient had just a minute. Okay. So this particular patient had head tilt towards the other side. This patient had pure torsional nystagmus, which was mixed variety of nystagmus without fixation. He had impaired contralateral smooth pursuit, and these were the findings in this particular patient. Okay. Now coming to anatomy of this lateral medulla. So this is the lateral medulla, and in this particular patient had hiccups, which and patient can have dysphagia due to the involvement of 10th nerve or involvement of vagus. Patient had Horner syndrome because of involvement of descending sympathetic tract. The involvement of restiform body olivocerebellar fibers can lead to ataxia, and the involvement of this if there is additional involvement of spinocerebellar tract, patients can have limb ataxia also. Nucleus ambiguous involvement can cause dysphagia, loss of palatal reflex. Patients can have hiccups. Patients can have ipsilateral loss of facial sensations because of involvement of descending nucleus and tract of fifth nerve. And patients can have loss of taste sensations also. Patients can have vertigo, nystagmus of vestibular variety. The peripheral variety of nystagmus can happen because of involvement of vestibular nucleus. So these are the findings in lateral medullary syndrome. And in medial medullary syndrome, the patients can have INO, or patients can have involvement of 12th nerve nucleus. Patients can have weakness in the pyramidal tract, and motor weakness the patients can have. So these are some of the things which were seen in this particular patient. And like if you look at the lateral medullary syndrome and this particular patient had contralateral sensory loss. Patient had ipsilateral cerebellar ataxia, and I couldn't patient had ipsilateral Horner syndrome, and in his symptoms he told about the hiccups. So now everything is getting correlated, and last time we discussed about recurrent vestibulopathy of peripheral origin, but this case turned out to be of central etiology. It's a very long case. I thought of discussing because it was so interesting, and there are so many things which I learned from this case, so I thought I will share. And these questions I posed last time. I posed while I presented this case. Last time I posed this question: I can't explain the severe torsional oscillopsia. I can't explain the head tilt. I can't explain the improvement on patching. I can't explain the normal MRI, but MRI was not normal. And I started the patient on thiamine and vestibular rehabilitation, and patient was already on antiplatelet. But why the patient is not improving, I'm going to tell. Why he's getting recurrent episode despite of antiplatelets, we will discuss that in a while. So to summarize, this patient had discrete episodes of acute vestibular syndrome. Patient has left hemianesthesia and hiccups. Patient MRI brain showed this lateral medullary infarct. Patient has contraversive tilt, torsional oscillopsia, saccadic smooth pursuit, impaired contralateral smooth pursuit, predominantly torsional nystagmus with fixation, Horner syndrome, high global cardiovascular risk, and paretic type of hyperventilation-induced nystagmus. The nystagmus is not obeying the Alexander's law. Uh, Head impulse test is pathological, the contralateral to ataxia, and the subjective visual vertical is abnormal. So these are the all signs, and the last one is atypical Unterberger's test because it was not typical of peripheral vestibulopathy. So the final diagnosis in this patient is right lateral medullary infarct, which is shown by the MRI. And this why this patient is getting recurrent attacks, we will discuss. So many a times this differentiation between the central and peripheral vestibular etiologies is not so clear cut, and it is something similar to differentiation between like what is difference between a husband and wife. It is not so simple like you can tell few differences. There are so many things, so many differences. Many a times in conferences it is asked that tell a single difference between central and peripheral. It is not so simple. Like we have to correlate a lot of signs, and sometimes hints can be deceiving. Head impulse can be positive in central lesions. Sometimes the nystagmus can be of peripheral variety in central lesions. So it's very important to look for other signs also and to correlate everything clinically. Okay. So this was the poll last time which I posed, and I would like to congratulate these two voters for this vertebrobasilar ischemia because it turned out to be a vascular cause. Okay, I think the voting is not working, so we will go ahead. So the final lesson, this is not the, these are the lessons which were taught by the patient. This is not over. There is one more lesson the patient taught to me is this particular thing. You can see this vertebral artery is compressing the ventrolateral aspect of medulla. And it is insinuating in the ventrolateral aspect of medulla. Okay. So this particular in this particular patient, the patient had additional this vertebral artery compression syndrome, which we are going to discuss. I think my time, I have still 6 minutes. I'll cover second case because it was a long case. So I thought there are so many learning points. So that's why I discussed in so many details. This particular case I presented in NES Patna in December, January 2020. Patient is a known diabetic and hypertensive. He came with history of recurrent spontaneous attacks of vertigo lasting for 20 minutes, and patient had associated imbalance and shaking of vision. And patient had one such episode 2 months ago, and now he was getting at the time of presentation, the patient presented with multiple such episodes. Okay, and the episodes were not positionally triggered, and that was one clue. But sometimes even in TIs, it could be positionally triggered attacks. I have another case where the patient had positionally triggered attack, and it turned out to be a nodular infarction. So we will go ahead how do you approach, like in this particular patient, which syndrome we are dealing with is we are dealing with spontaneous episodic vestibular syndrome. Spontaneous because it is not positionally triggered, episodic because it is happening in episodes in between the attacks. The patient is okay, and patient has vestibular symptoms. So definitely in this group of patients, it is very important to do imaging because the patient had vascular risk factors. And let us move ahead. What happened in this particular patient, I'll just show you. So this particular patient had, if keep looking at the vertebral artery, just a minute. Yeah. So look at this vertebral artery on the left side. Keep looking at it. Now it is turning, going towards the right side. It has gone towards ventral aspect of the medulla. and then it is compressing the dorsolateral, like ventrolateral medulla. Look at the compression it is causing. It is completely distorting the medulla oblongata. So, and look at the course of this particular vertebral artery. It is going from left side towards the right side. Okay, it started from the left, and the course is going towards the left side. In that process, it is compressing the ventrolateral aspect of the medulla. So you can see the compression here of this vertebral artery causing compression of the ventrolateral aspect of right side of the medulla. So let us discuss some anatomy of this vertebral artery. Like this is the aorta. Okay, and this is again the arch of aorta. This is left common carotid. This is left subclavian artery. This is right brachiocephalic trunk, and this is subclavian artery on the right side. And this is vertebral artery which originates from the right-sided subclavian artery. And this is the first part of subclavian artery. Okay, on the right side and the left side. Okay, that is the first part of subclavian artery from which the vertebral artery arises. So let us see what are the parts of vertebral artery. The V1, it starts from the subclavian from the left side, and both the sides actually from the subclavian artery, and it reaches the vertebral foramina of the C6, that is V1. Okay, V2 is from the vertebral foramina of C6 up to the C2 is nothing but the V2. V3 is nothing but after coming out from C2 like vertebral foramina till it pierces the dura mater, that is V3. And V4 is after piercing the dura until it joins the other vertebral artery to form the basilar artery is nothing but the V4. So why we are discussing about vertebral artery is because there are 4 syndromes which are associated with vertebral artery or the vertebrobasilar artery circulation. One is subclavian steal syndrome. Second is rotational vertebral artery syndrome, and in which one of the side of the vertebral artery is hypoplastic. That is, the diameter is less than 2 millimeters at V4, and one of the artery is dominant, which gets compressed on turning the neck, okay, towards the hypoplastic. Okay, so turning the neck to one side can cause this rotational vertebral artery symptoms. Okay, then coming to the next syndrome which is associated with vertebral arteries, vertebral artery dissections. So these are the 3 syndromes which we are aware of, but there is one more syndrome called as vertebral artery compression syndrome. Okay, and it's a relatively new syndrome. And one more point I would like to tell is when to call a artery as dolichoectatic is nothing but when the diameter of the vertebral artery is more than 4.5 millimeter at midpoints, then it is called as vertebral artery dolichoectasia. Okay, so this is one paper on hypoplastic vertebral artery in which they have shown that hypoplastic vertebral artery is not rare in normal population. It is frequent in posterior circulation stroke, and the patients with hypoplastic vertebral artery have high chances of getting a posterior circulation stroke as compared to a normal caliber artery. That was this paper. And coming back to the vertebral artery compression syndrome, there was a paper in 2006 by Professor Louis Kaplan, who is one of the pioneer in stroke neurology. And in this particular paper, they have demonstrated that it is not only the dolichoectatic vertebral artery which causes compression of medulla. The normal caliber vertebral artery can also cause compression of the medulla. So this study is the largest collection, and medullary vascular compression can occur and it can present as TIA. And in this particular series, they presented 9 patients, symptomatic patients. So like currently I have around 9 cases of this particular syndrome in last 3 years. And this is a very relatively common entity, and it's very important that we should look for this particular compression syndrome in patients with TIA. And coming to the pathogenesis of this syndrome is the artery causes pulsatile impact over the tortuous vertebral artery on brainstem, and it leads to blood flow insufficiency of the perforating vessels. So it is nothing but TIA. It is a sort of vertebrobasilar insufficiency. It is not something like vestibular paroxysmia or a neurovascular compression of a nerve where it causes ephaptic conduction. It is a vascular phenomenon. Okay, so we know about the vascular compression syndromes of the nerve where there is excitatory dysfunction of various cranial nerves. Of the cranial nerve 4, it can lead to superior oblique myochemia. Trigeminal neuralgia is very well known. Hemifacial spasm can happen in case of facial nerve. In case of 8th nerve, tinnitus and vestibular paroxysmia are well known. Glossopharyngeal neuralgia in case of 9th nerve. In case of 10th nerve, the patients can have unexplained episodes of syncopal attack. Patients can have hypertension. Even the hypertension can happen in patients with neurovascular compression on the 10th nerve. And 11th nerve, torticollis can happen in some patients with this particular vascular syndrome. So coming to vascular compression of the brainstem, transient ischemic attack or stroke can happen in patients with these particular syndrome, like vertebral artery compression syndrome. And management, according to the 2 papers I have quoted, is antiplatelets and statins treat it like a stroke. And most of the patients in their series, they demonstrated that the patients had improvement after starting the antiplatelets and statins. So again, I will go back to the case number 1. The final lesson taught by the patient is nothing but the vertebral artery compressing the ventrolateral aspect of medulla. You can see the deformation of the medulla because of this vertebral artery compression. You can see here it is deforming the ventrolateral aspect of the medulla. So we have to keep this particular syndrome in mind. And why this particular patient is not improving is because maybe what I feel is, despite of being starting him on antiplatelet, because of this vertebral artery compression, he is not improving and he's getting ischemia into these perforating vessels which are supplying the medulla. And I have a total collection of 9 cases now. I have retrospectively, I missed a case in March 2018 where the patient had a large vertebral artery which was compressing the medulla. This patient presented with typical like unresponsiveness. Like before the unresponsiveness, she felt vertigo, and she was unresponsive for 15 minutes and she was hospitalized and she recovered. It was a TIA, posterior circulation TIA. And this is a patient which case number 2, which I presented just now. So case 1 and case 2 presented today. These are the 2 cases. 1 case I missed in the past. These are the 3 cases, and I could diagnose 6 more cases from December like 2019. We have to really look for this particular compression, and we have to correlate clinically. I have 3 cases where the patient didn't present like transient ischemic attack. They have some other vestibular diagnosis. And 1 case was recently discussed in one forum by Dr. Samir Sethi, who is a neurootologist from Delhi, India. And that was a very interesting case where you can see the dolichoectatic vertebral artery compressing the ventrolateral aspect of the pons here. And you can see the dolichoectatic artery. So large artery, and it is not only the large artery, it can even the normal caliber vessels also can compress the. This is the cut where the pons at the level of this is superior cerebellar peduncle, and this is the cut at the level of upper pons. Okay. So, in the case which was presented by Dr. Samir Sethi, a patient had gaze-evoked nystagmus, patient had spontaneous downbeat nystagmus, patient had bilateral pathological hit and impaired viewer separation test, and patient even had positional downbeat nystagmus. So, a patient had multiple manifestations of ischemia of posterior circulation because of this vertebral artery compression syndrome. So think of transient ischemic attacks if vascular risk factors are present, associated neurological signs and symptoms. Even monosymptomatic vertigo can happen in TIAs, 8% of the TIAs, but it's very important to determine the ABCD score or global cardiovascular risk score. And positional testing, if it is negative in a patient with episodic vestibular syndrome, think of TIAs, okay? So that was about the case number 2, and case number 3 and 4 are just one slide cases, and after that I'll finish just in one slides. This is like recently I treated one patient of BPPV on a video call. This is the patient's daughter. This is patient who is sitting in Russia, and her like sister, the patient, the patient's daughter. She was holding this phone, and she was we were guiding her to undergo the BPPV, the Dick-Salpike maneuver, and the patient had posterior canal BPPV, and I repositioned with Epley's maneuver. So that video call, we can treat the patients in this pandemic situation. And that was case number 3. And case number 4, one important finding I see in patients with BPPV is when you ask the patient to sit, they firmly hold the table, like the bed, and they feel a lot of postural instability. This is something similar to what we do in while after sitting in roller coaster. So there is a trunk retropulsion. The trunk goes backwards. The trunk retropulsion is very commonly seen in patients with BPPV before doing the positional testing. So there was one study by Professor Bella Buki, and in which they demonstrated this trunk retropulsion in patients with BPPV, in this particular patient. So that was about the case number 4, and I will stop here. And I'll just tell you plan in future. I have multiple cases, like there are some gait videos, interesting gait videos. There are some few patients with multiple sclerosis and vestibular manifestation, few patients with stroke and vestibular, interesting vestibular findings, orthostatic dizziness patients. Recently, I'm encountering patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. I have 5 patients who are experiencing dizziness, and 2 of them had COVID infection in the past, in the recent past. Vestibular neuritis, vestibular paroxysmia, triple PD. One by one, we will I will club the cases, and I'll present these cases in our future webinars. And that's I'll stop here, and I will be happy to answer your question. Over to you, Dr. Sriharsha.
Sir, thank you, sir. It was really wonderful session. We had a few learning take-home messages on transient ischemic attacks and relation with vertebral artery. Something this is which I learned today. So there was one question, sir. Can osteophytes of cervical vertebrae compress the vertebral artery?
Yes, there are some studies which show that it has to be very significant, like the osteoarthritis, but to the osteophytes causing compression, it is positively correlates with the atherosclerotic process also. So something which is happening endovascularly is atherosclerosis, and something which is compressing from outside is this thing like cervical osteophytes, which are compressing the vertebral artery. That can happen, and that can contribute to vertebrobasilar insufficiency in elderly patients. Yes, it can happen.
And one more question, sir. When do you usually suspect vertebral artery enlargement to be the cause of compression? Any
Yeah.
specific diagnostic pointers?
Yes, we should diagnostic pointers is spontaneous episodic vestibular syndrome. If the patient presents with history suggestive of TIA, then we should definitely think of this, and MRI shows this particular condition. Because as I have told, I have 3 patients who don't have like TIAs. They were one patient is recently I saw in last week. She has typical history of migraine, not even vestibular migraine, routine migraine patient, and I just saw her MRI. But she is more likely in future to have this particular syndrome, and it can lead to TIA. So if a history is correlating with this MRI, then only we should consider it as significant.
Okay. So I request the audience to unmute and interact with the speaker to get your any queries.
Sir, can you explain regarding hyperinflation-induced nystagmus, the paratic excitatory, the significance of them, sir? Each pattern.
Yeah. So what happens in case of hyperventilation is when we hyperventilate, the CO2 level goes down. Like there is a CO2 washout. Okay. After CO2 washout, there are changes in the calcium concentration. The calcium concentration drops intracellular. So what happens during after hyperventilation is the conduction of the denervated or demyelinating neurons or inflammatory, like because of vestibular neuritis, if there is involvement of vestibular nerve, it that there is improvement in the conduction of those neurons. So that's why whichever pathology causes demyelination of the nerve, for example, CP angle tumors, vestibular paroxysmia. Even in central regions, we can get hyperventilation-induced nystagmus. Like even in case of vestibular migraine, it is common to get hyperventilation-induced nystagmus. And in tumors also, like tumors of the brainstem, we can get hyperventilation-induced nystagmus. So there are there are 4 varieties of hyperventilation-induced nystagmus. If suppose a patient has right vestibulopathy, imagine, and we do the hyperventilation test. Okay, so the paratic pattern is nothing but the patient will have spontaneous left beating nystagmus. In a patient with right vestibulopathy, patient might have left beating nystagmus. So if we hyperventilate this particular patient, the patient, it enhances the leg beating component of the nystagmus. Okay, so that is a paratic type of nystagmus, and that is not the one which I was discussing about the demyelinating. The demyelinating variety is excitatory type of nystagmus, and the inflammatory or paratic type of nystagmus is nothing but it increases the underlying asymmetry. It increases the underlying asymmetry, and in case of excitatory, what happens? Either the spontaneous nystagmus might disappear, or it might go into reversal, that is strongly excitatory. So what Professor Luigi Califano in his paper, they tried to differentiate vascular versus inflammatory etiology based on the hyperventilation induced nystagmus. They tried to differentiate, and they found that a paratic type of nystagmus is more in favor of, but it has to be associated with the other type. See, all these varieties of nystagmus can be seen in inflammatory or vascular etiology, but it should be associated with high global cardiovascular risk and the spontaneous nystagmus like less than 72 hours duration. So ultimately, it is not only one single sign which is important. It is a conglomeration of signs. We have to correlate clinically. If we get hyperventilation induced nystagmus, it doesn't mean that it is CP angle tumor or it is a vestibular paroxysmia. It has to be correlated clinically also what vestibular syndrome we are dealing with, as well as we have to see what type of hyperventilation induced nystagmus. In my practice, I see the most common cause of hyperventilation induced nystagmus is vestibular migraine. I have patients with CP angle tumor with hyperventilation induced nystagmus, vestibular paroxysmia, vestibular neuritis can show. So it's very important which syndrome which we are dealing with, and then we can correlate the hyperventilation induced nystagmus. Alone, hyperventilation induced nystagmus doesn't have a very high clinical significance, but in presence of other factors, it does have it can correlate.
Thank you, sir.
Any more questions? So I think we have come to the end of the Q&A session, sir.
Yeah.
So I think you have lined up for a very interesting series of topics for the upcoming 8th episode. So we are eagerly waiting for your next series, sir. So thank you, sir, once again. It was a really nice session today. I hope the audience had a very good learning session. Interesting cases were presented today. So with this, I would like to conclude today's session and have a good night.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending.